Let's talk a bit about how you can prevent swarming then. It's very hard. You might read resources online that say you can definitely stop your bees swarming. You can't. It's very hard to stop a natural instinct of the bees. You can slow it down, but it's very hard to actually stop. We've tried amongst our 100-odd hives, every single thing that you read about online that says it stops swarming, and none of them actually stop swarming. They just reduce swarming, but they don't stop it. So first of all, for those that don't know, the swarming sort of impulse is about this time of year when it's starting to get, the days are getting longer and they're getting warmer, and there's supposed to be more food around, although that's not the case at the moment. And if your beehive is populous enough, the bees will decide to swarm. So they'll make a number of queen cells, and just before the first of those queen cells hatches, half your bees will take off and land somewhere within about 50 meters of your beehive, usually, and then send out scouts looking for a new home to move into. And that's your bee swarm. Those swarms will move on sometimes. They won't hang around, so they can take off and hop multiple times before they find somewhere to go. The thing, if your hive actually swarms, let's talk about that first, what you should do if your hive swarms. First of all, catch the swarm. Don't let it go. My personal opinion that if you're a beekeeper and your hive swarms, you should catch it. Don't let it go because it can cause a nuisance. And plenty of councils are dealing with nuisance swarms at the moment. Well, not at the moment, but will be shortly. And if there's enough nuisance swarms, there's a chance that that we will be regulated in some way and prevent us from being beekeepers. So we don't want that. So catch your swarms so they don't cause a problem. You should then do an inspection of your beehive. Look inside your beehive and look for queen cells. If you find a number of queen cells and they're closed, what you should do is remove some of those queen cells to prevent your hive from swarming again and again and again, because sometimes they will do that. And if you leave one viable queen cell, then your hive has a chance of surviving. That queen will hatch and will go and mate. And if everything goes well, within a few weeks, you'll see eggs inside your beehive. If you hang on to the swarm that your hive pitched, you can always recombine those together again using the newspaper method if your hive doesn't make a new queen. So you can save your beehive. It's not like a swarming is a fatal thing to your beehive. It's natural replication of the hives. The trick with queen cells is that if you find a queen cell in the middle of the frame, so not at the bottom, but in the middle of the frame, it's usually a supersedure cell where the beehive's getting rid of the queen because they think there's something wrong with her. So it's best not to fiddle with those ones. It's more that you find a swarming cell at the bottom of the frame and they're actual swarm cells. Okay, so you've got your beehive. You want to try and do something about the swarming and limit it. So the first thing you should do is keep doing regular inspections. If you keep doing regular inspections, if you're lucky, you will open the beehive up at the point where there's a whole lot of queen cells. And that's the point at which you can split the beehive to prevent it from swarming. And splitting is like doing a manual swarm. So to split your beehive, what you do is you'll need either a nucleus box or a spare 8-frame brood box or whatever box that you've got. And you put that beside your existing hive. It doesn't have to be a distance away, it can be right beside it. You go through your donor hive, the one that's going to swarm, and find the queen. It's really important that you find the queen because you're actually taking the queen out of that beehive to make them think the queen has swarmed. So you find the queen, some of the brood, some of the honey, some of the open brood, some of the capped brood, about half, and put it into your split. Make sure there's no queen cells being put across into the split. Otherwise, the hive will swarm. And then the donor beehive, make sure you've left a couple of queen cells behind, 1 or 2, no more than that. And then what will happen is that hopefully the original beehive, the queens will hatch, go out and mate, and everything will be fine. And you've already got the queen in the hive that you split out. If for some reason, after a few weeks, you don't see eggs in the hive that was swarming, you can always join that back in again, and that will mean that you'll have a beehive that's fully operational with a queen. Part of the swarming instinct is if the hive is really tight on space, the bees are more likely to swarm. So there's various theories and various methods that you can use. Personally, I haven't found them to be particularly successful, but it's not a bad idea to be changing some frames out of the brood box anyway. So what I would be doing is about this time of year, going into the brood box and pulling out maybe the wall frames that are usually fully capped with honey, and take those out and move them upstairs into your honey super, and put in some brand new frames or frames with brand new wax in to replace those wall frames, but put them in not at the edge, put them in a couple of frames in. And what that does is you're changing the wax over in your brood box. So old wax in the brood box is particularly bad because it can harbor diseases. So changing the wax over is a really good thing. And if you can do that a couple of times a year, you're slowly getting fresh wax through the beehives. So you're helping to keep that disease load down. Now, with those frames that you moved up, what you then do is once they become full of capped honey, you take them away and replace them with brand new frames or brand new wax. And so you've cycled that old wax completely out of the beehive into your wax stores or whatever you're doing with your wax, and put a brand new foundation back into the hive. The other methods are all various methods around that about giving the bees more space. There's all sorts of names for what they're doing, but really a split is the most reliable way of making sure the hive's not going to swarm.
Doug, you can do also probably brood lifting on the above the queen excluder?
Yeah, look, I mean, you can. So what Olivier is referring to there is moving up frames of capped brood above the excluder. The risk is there if you move up a frame that's got uncapped brood, is sometimes the bees get a bit confused and make a queen up there. So make sure it's fully capped brood that you're moving up. Also, if you've got drone brood on that frame, the drones will get caught above the excluder. So you've got to let them out, basically. Once they hatch, they're too big to fit through the excluder and they get stuck, which is sad because you find all these basically drone heads on the excluder because they've died and couldn't get out. So yeah, moving brood up. There's a few different methods called checkerboarding, which is variations of the things that we've talked about with moving frames. And you'll also, if you look online, you'll see people talking about doing basically an artificial swarm where they actually dump all the bees out and remove all the brood and throw it away. I don't think that's particularly successful, and there's all sorts of risks in doing that, especially when it's as cold as this. So I wouldn't be playing with those ideas. Maybe a bit later on, play with it if you want to give it a go. It seems a bit brutal to me. And we've had varying rates of non-success anyway. So maybe do a split is probably the most reliable. And you can split even if there's no queen cells, because the bees will make queen cells. The cold weather over winter doesn't really seem to impact how much the bees swarm when swarming season comes. There've already been quite a number of swarms, and that number is just going to accelerate. What tends to happen at this time of year is if we get a lot of rain, is conversely, we get a lot more swarms. So what happens is the bees get all stuck inside with nothing to do, and it's more likely that the hive will swarm if we get patches of warm weather and patches of rain than it would be if we got warm weather all the way through. So it's a weird thing, swarming. It's good that we had a cold winter. We needed it. So you know, that's what winters should be like, what we've just had. Maybe not as much rain, but they should be cold. And the cold weather actually helps with bud set, so you get better nectar flows. So if it doesn't rain, we're going to have a very big season this year. If it rains, we're not, because the rain is going to wash the nectar away. So spring is when the bees are at the highest chance of starving, not during winter. Because right now, if you open your hive up, you'll find there's a lot of brood appearing in the hive. If you're in the Sydney Basin, that is, there's lots of brood appearing in the hive, and all that brood needs to be fed. And with the weather the way it is, with this rain, the rain is slowing down nectar or washing the nectar away. So it's really important to keep an eye on your bees at the moment and make sure they've got enough food, because spring and early spring is when bees starve. It's not generally through winter. And that's such it sounds a bit weird, but it's true. And overseas in cold climates, you might read about cold storage being used for bees. And the reason they put bees into cold storage, which is a big fridge, is they keep the bees in there until spring has properly sprung. and there's enough nectar around to keep the bees alive, then they move the bees out of the cold storage. And that way they don't have to feed the bees extra in spring, and the bees are fine. They come into a warmer spring where everything's flowering. Obviously, we can't do that unless you've got a big fridge at home. So we need to just keep an eye on what the bees are doing and make sure they've got enough food. And if they need feeding, then don't hesitate to feed them sugar. It's better that you feed them sugar than have them starve. So as far as what you feed and how you feed, at this time of year, it would be okay to start feeding the thinner syrup rather than the thicker syrup. You can also feed fondant, or you could feed dry sugar at a pinch. The bees will still use it, but it all must be internal. It can't be external. Don't feed honey. For anybody that's thinking they might give the bees a top up by feeding honey, research overseas has shown that the bees are less likely to survive if you feed them honey, and more likely to survive if you feed them sugar, which makes no sense at all, but that's what the research has shown.
So when you say thinner, are you saying like 2 to 1?
Yeah. So 1 to 1. So the reason for that is, like, if you feed a 1 to 1 syrup, the bees will store, and it's not as thin as nectar. 2 to 1, the bees will, it's like nectar, and it actually stimulates the bees to grow, which is what's going to be happening right now anyway. Some people might think that you need to feed pollen patties. It's probably unnecessary to feed pollen patties in spring. There's so much pollen around at the moment. We're seeing a lot of pollen coming into our hives. There's no need to feed pollen patties. And the other thing with pollen patties is you've got to watch them for hive beetle, because small hive beetle loves breeding in pollen patties. So I'd just be looking at honey stores and making sure they've got enough carbohydrate. Don't worry too much about the protein. There's plenty of that around at the moment. So bees need 2 things. They need carbohydrate and protein. And so carbohydrate comes from your honey or your sugar, which is a replacement for honey. Protein, the bees get that by collecting pollen. And so sometimes if there's not enough pollen around, you can supplement it by buying a supplement feeder, which is usually not made of pollen. It's usually made of soy flour and other stuff that comes in a patty form that you can put inside the beehive. At this time of year, really, in Sydney, I don't think they're necessary. There's plenty of pollen around. If there was a dearth of pollen, like in a drought, maybe you might need to feed them pollen, but right now I think they're fine.
I had a question about starving. What are the signs of a starving hive? Like, if there is honey upstairs, that's fine, right?
Yeah, well, because we're a warm climate primarily. So let's talk about the Sydney Basin again, because once you get out of the Sydney Basin, it's different, right? But in the Sydney Basin, if the bees have got honey upstairs, they will usually be fine. If the bees have no honey, and typically if you open up the brood box and there's no honey in the corners of the frames in the brood box at this time of year, that's a sign that the bees haven't got any food and you need to think about feeding them. It's usually pretty obvious. You look inside the beehive and you see there's very little honey, time to give them something.
But you could just take some downstairs.
Yeah, if it's there. Typically it's not. So typically there's nothing there, and that's the problem. You will often hear novice beekeepers say, my bees just all died suddenly. And that's usually starvation, because very few diseases do that. And even pesticide takes a while to kill a beehive. But if the bees overnight all die, it's usually because they've run out of food and just starved.
And they will die with the egg inside the cells. And
yeah. So you'll see those photos online. Sometimes people will go on Facebook and say, my bees died, this is what it looked like. And all you'll see is the little stripy bums sticking out of the cells. And that's the bees trying to find food in the bottom of the cells. It's quite a sad sight, because it's preventable, you know.